for this, what I want to do is grab onto here and here, pop this free. Now we'll come right up here. We're going to remove this from the throttle body. Typically there's going to be a clamp of some sort, but on this vehicle there isn't. It's pretty much just a press fit. So I'm just going to grab onto it and try to roll it off. There we are. Let's grab onto our air temp sensor. There's a little clip along the backside. You just carefully grab onto that, slowly pull it away, and it should want to separate. Every time you disconnect an electrical connector, you want to inspect it, make sure you don't see any funny colors. Let's go ahead and get this out of the way. Set this aside. Inside here is going to be your air filter. It makes sense to go ahead and take a peek at that as well. Now that we have that out of the way, we have a nice clear view of the bolt right down along the side of the transmission right here. To make it a little bit easier to see on video, I'm just going to go ahead and get this out of here. It's just a couple 8mm headed screws, and then I can move this aside. We're going to use an 18mm wrench to try to remove this bolt right here. That's the upper bolt for this mount bracket. Now when you go to take this off, just be careful because it might potentially hit up against the body a little bit and you don't want to get your wrench or anything else stuck on there. Okay. So now at this point, this is out of the transmission. We can leave this bolt in this position and we can go ahead and remove that bracket with it here. When we do, the bolt's probably going to want to fall out of there. Just keep that in mind when we go to reinstall it. You want to have the bolt in this area when you reinstall this bracket. Now looking up above the driver's side lower control arm, you can see where the rest of that bracket is. It's fairly simple to get in here to finish removing those two 18mm headed bolts, but for me personally, I'm going to go ahead and remove this driver's side wheel so I can gain access easier. Now let's safely raise and support the front of our vehicle so the wheel's off the ground. After that, remove all 5 of your 19mm lug nuts and then the wheel. With the wheel out of the way, let's continue on to removing this plastic fender well panel. You're going to find several push clips on this that hold it to either the body or even the bumper as you go around. Ours in particular has 2 screws as well. Pretty much anything that holds this panel on, just go ahead and remove it. Generally 4 push clips. What you're going to notice is you pull out the center, it'll unlock, and then you can slide it out. Inspect this, remove it from the vehicle. With that panel out of the way, we have a nice clear view of this entire mount area. There's going to be 2 more 18mm headed bolts that hold the bracket to the transmission. Let's go ahead and remove the pair. Let's come right up through the hole in the control arm to remove this 21mm nut. You can see the brackets starting to come down. Be very careful that this doesn't fall out of the vehicle and potentially hurt you. At this point, we're going to go ahead and start removing this bracket from the rubber mount. After we get this out of the way, we'll have access to our last mounting bolt for this bracket. Start taking this apart. If you look along the back side here, you can see that it has a hook. Essentially, you just want to push this a little bit and slide it out of there. With that out of the way, we have a nice clear view of our last bolt. Now to get enough swing with the wrench to be able to remove this, I'm going to come right over here to where this wire is mounted on. I'm just going to use a pick. I'm going to carefully get in between this area and try to separate this so I can move the wiring. Now we can start removing this. All right, there we go. grab onto that bolt. So now what we're gonna do is go ahead and grab onto this bracket, and you're gonna notice as you try to wiggle it around, that upper bolt that we had to leave in the bracket could potentially still be hitting up against either the brake lines up there or even hitting up against the inside aspect of this and the transmission. To help deal with this, I'm gonna use a pry bar as leverage. I'm gonna come up and in between, hitting up against the transmission in this area and also up against the subframe. I'm going to carefully try to pry, just essentially shifting this enough so I can move this bracket around and get it out of position. There we are. Now at this point, we don't need to move this bracket any further than this. I don't want to risk damaging my brake lines in any way. Now with that out of the way, we can make our way up inside this area here, and we're going to remove the nut that's on the forward or inboard side of this area right here. It's going to be an 18mm nut, and you just reach right up inside, and you should be able to get it off of there. All right, so now that we have the nut off up top there, let's go ahead and make our way here, and we'll go ahead and take this bolt right out. And give it an inspection, set it aside. Now we can move along to these two nuts. Let's use our 18mm. Go ahead and hold that mount so it doesn't fall and potentially hurt you. Okay friends, now it's time to install our driver's side transmission mount. Let's go ahead and take this, and we're going to slide it right over these studs. Once you have it over those, I'm just going to take this bolt and we'll slide it right on through, and we're going to put the hook inside this groove. Now we can start on both of our mounting nuts. After they're both started, let's bottom them out and tighten them up. Now we can torque each of these to 52 foot-pounds. Let's go ahead and put on the nut on the other side of that bolt. We'll just make our way all the way into the engine compartment here, and usually you can access this either from the top or even from the bottom. Now I'm going to go ahead and bottom this out, and when we torque it, you're going to torque it to 59 foot-pounds. If you can't get a torque wrench in this area, just go ahead and make sure it's tight. Now we can go ahead and tighten up this nut that's on the inboard side of this bolt. Once it's tight, you want to torque it to 59 foot-pounds. If you can't torque it because there isn't much room here, just go ahead and make sure it's nice and tight with your wrench. Let's get our bracket back in there. Now this top bolt is essentially a trapped bolt because once you put it up in here, you remember that it did not want to come out of this bracket. So I'm just going to start it in there. We'll put this all the way up as high as we can. We're also going to line up the stud for the mount at the same time. If it feels like it's getting caught, don't try to push it because it could be hitting up against your brake lines, and you don't want to damage your brake lines in any way. Now let's go ahead and start in one of our mounting bolts from down here. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to carefully use a pry bar, and essentially I just want to be able to pry the transmission and everything towards the passenger side so I can start in this one bolt up top here. Just have to get it lined up. It's going to be hard. There we are. Now we can start putting that in. Make sure it doesn't feel like it's under any resistance, otherwise it could be cross-threaded. Alright, so at this point I left the bracket so it's still loose enough to move around. Let's continue on putting in all the rest of the bolts before we tighten any of them up completely. Get our last two bolts in here as well. With all of them started, let's bottom them out. Now we can re-secure our wire. Make sure that's locked in and it's secure so it's not shaking around. You don't want it to get caught on anything. Now once you're sure all of the bracket bolts are nice and tight, let's continue on to putting on the bracket that goes over the mount itself. To do that, I'm just going to carefully slide it into place, having it so the bolt hole is going to be facing towards the front a little bit, kind of diagonally. Now what I want to do is grab onto the rest of this. And if you look at the back side of this bracket, you can see that it has this area where the hook on the metal bracket is going to sit. Let's go ahead and get this into position. I'm going to bring this hook all the way around. Should want to slide in there. Now we're going to bring this around into position. And essentially the position that this needs to be in isn't an area that is going to protect the axle from getting bonked by anything. So if you look along this area, as long as it's pretty much flush, that should be good. So now let's go ahead and put on our bolt right here, and then we can snug it up. Make sure that's nice and tight so it's not going to shake around on you while you're driving down the road. Let's apply some red thread locker to the stud down here. We can start on our nut. Now we're going to start tightening this. While we tighten it, what we want to pay attention to is this bracket making its way up to the mount itself. Now you can either just tighten this and bring it up, or of course you can put a jack underneath the engine to be able to jack it up and put it into position first. Now let's apply a little bit of pressure underneath the engine. We're going to start jacking it up, so this right here will hit directly against the mount. Let's bottom this out. And now we'll torque this to 59 foot-pounds. Let's get the jack out from under here. Let's get this shield back in here. We're going to bring it directly underneath this area. Slide it up a little bit. Let's slide this into position. Let's try to line up all of our push clips. Start a couple of them in here. There should be a couple that go across the bottom that would come from the front, pushing through. Ours were missing. Let's get this panel in here as well. Ours had these screws. Time to get the wheel back on here. We'll start on all of our 19mm lug nuts, bottom them out, and then we'll get the wheel back on the ground and torque each of them to 100 foot-pounds. Okay, we have the wheel safely back down on the ground. Let's go ahead and torque these in a crisscross manner. Okay, it's bottomed out. Make sure it's nice and tight. Now we can start putting our box back on here. Let's pay attention to this area. And also, on the other side of the box. Now with all that, let's go ahead and take this. We'll start this side in first, slide it up against the front. Now we can come over here. We'll line up this tab as well, slide it down. Give it a little wiggle to make sure it's secure. Now we can take this piece here. We have all these little pitons. They're going to line up with the holes down along the bottom. Time for the air filter. Now we can put the inboard cover on here. We have all these. They need to line up with their holes down there. Once the two covers are touching, go ahead and put on your clips. Now we're going to make our way up here. We want to slide this all the way up against the throttle body. Put it in position, just work it around. Before you go any further, you need to double check all the way around to make sure it's completely seated up against that throttle body. You don't want any dirty air making its way into the engine. Now let's reconnect our air temp sensor. Make sure it's secure.
Okay friends, we got the car back together. What's left to do now? Now of course you're going to want to start up the vehicle, let it run for a little while. We want to make sure we don't have any strange vibrations coming from the engine. Aside from that, while it's running, make sure the check engine light's not on. Assuming everything seems fine, take it for a road test. Thanks for watching.